I was going to point out to Brigadier Naeem, if you can look right over my head, do you see the thing that's framed in red? That is my diploma from the University of Baluchistan that I got during at the Staff College. You're muted, sir.
Colonel Smith, we're live. We'll maybe pick that up a little bit later.
BSc Honors War Studies.
There's an interesting story about that I'll tell you sometime offline about how I got that.
Okay.
I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome and thanks to all of you for joining us today, whether from the United States, India, Pakistan, or elsewhere. My name is Akriti Vasudeva, and I'm a research analyst at the Stimson Center and editor-at-large at South Asian Voices, an online policy platform that features analysis on the security, politics, and economics of South Asia. I'm delighted to welcome you today to the 6th South Asian Voices webinar, a series we began last year to examine significant developments in the region. And today we will discuss 2 books by Stimson Distinguished Fellow Colonel David Smith, titled The Wellington Experience and the Quetta Experience, that provide insight into the Indian and Pakistani armies' internal and external threat perceptions. Colonel Smith's books are companion studies of the Pakistan Army and the Indian Army based on interviews with US military personnel who studied at the Pakistan Army's Command and Staff College in Quetta and the Defense Services Staff College in Wellington, respectively. The Pakistan study traces the evolution in the attitudes and values of the officer corps over a 37-year period from 1977 to 2014, while the Indian study does the same over a 38-year period from 1979 to 2017. This webinar, which is based on a South Asian Voices special series, will examine the themes in these books and assess their implications for India and Pakistan's bilateral security dynamics and each of their relationships with the United States and China, as well as what they may portend for both states' military strategy in the future. And to discuss all this and more, I'm delighted to have a very distinguished panel of experts from India and Pakistan joining me today. I'll introduce our panelists in the order that they will speak. So first, of course, is Colonel Dave Smith, who is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center's South Asia program. He served for 31 years in the US Army, 22 of which he spent dealing with political military issues in the Near East and South Asia, including 2 tours of duty as US Army attaché in Pakistan. Brigadier Naeem Salik is a senior fellow at the Center for International Strategic Studies in Islamabad. He served in the Pakistan Army in a variety of assignments for 33 years, including as Director of Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs at Pakistan Strategic Plans Division. Dr. Reshmi Kazi is Associate Professor at the Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi. She specializes in nuclear security, non-proliferation, and disarmament. She received her PhD from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and her doctoral thesis focused on the evolution of India's nuclear doctrine. Ms. Sadia Tasleem is a lecturer at the Quetta University's Department of Defense and Strategic Studies in Islamabad. She has done extensive research on various aspects of strategic stability and nuclear learning with a focus on Pakistan, and she was a 2014-2015 Robin Copeland Memorial Fellow. She received her MPhil and MSc in Defense and Strategic Studies from Quetta University. And last but not least, Dr. Aditi Malhotra is co-editor of the Journal for Intelligence, Propaganda, and Security Studies. She was the South Asian Voices Visiting Fellow in 2017 and previously worked as a researcher at the Center for Land Warfare Studies in New Delhi. Her research interests include Indo-Pacific security and geopolitics, nuclear nonproliferation, and strategy. And she holds a PhD in political science from the University of Münster, Germany. And let me also say that it is an honor to celebrate International Women's Day with these stellar scholars who've greatly enhanced the South Asia program's understanding of the region over the years. So I wanted to say more power to you, Ms. Tasleem, Dr. Malhotra, and Dr. Kazi. And now in terms of the flow of the event, we'll start with Colonel Smith presenting a summary of his observations and findings in the books. We will then go to each of our reviewers for their brief assessments of the books. And then I'll ask our panelists a set of questions before we open the floor to the audience. So we will be collecting your questions throughout this discussion. If you'd like to ask our panelists anything, please type your query into the Q&A box, and I'll try to get to as many questions as I can. I now invite Colonel Smith to share with us his arguments in these 2 fascinating books.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Stimson South Asia Voices team for conceiving of a joint discussion of these two books. It's nice to get any book reviewed. It's almost extraordinary to have 4 reviews at the same time on 2 different books. My plan was always to write 2 studies that could facilitate an apples to apples comparison of the Indian and Pakistani militaries, and that's why the methodology in both is identical. I do like to point out that the book provides a look at 3 distinctive groups of both Pakistani and Indian military officers, senior officers, faculty, and students over nearly 4 decades. But one of our early assumptions was that the reviewers that we were likely to have today would not have a military background, and that was why we decided to focus on the last 4 of the 5 different lines of inquiry in the book. Didn't know at the time that Brigadier Naeem Salik would be on the panel. He is certainly qualified to talk about the line of inquiry number 1, and I'm going to make a few comments about that. And then I'll turn to some of the other lines of inquiry. Line of inquiry 1 talks about the college experience in terms of demographics, social, cultural, organizational factors, and the curriculum. And I must say that the 2 institutions, DSSC and the Command and Staff College in Quetta, have far more commonalities in this line of inquiry than they have differences. Both institutions have the same parent. They employ the pedagogy that's derived from the British Commonwealth model. The students at both are selected primarily by competitive examinations. The students are mostly identical in terms of their arms and service backgrounds, which means that they are combat arms heavy and relatively light on what we call combat service support in the United States Army. And they constitute roughly the top 25 to 35% of their year groups. The focus on both institutions, however, seems to be primarily on evaluating the students for their promotion potential and only secondary on imparting a solid professional military education. It's true at both that only the top 10% of the graduates are likely to go on to become general officers. Now, the net impact of this is to create what I believe could be characterized as a toxic institutional culture that reinforces an already strong cultural propensity that does not lead to questioning of Army doctrine or the opinions of the faculty or the senior officers. It discourages the unorthodox solution to tactical problems and creates great pressure among the students to arrive at the school solution. This in turn leads to widespread cheating. This is what is called the use of CHAPA at Quetta, or the use of PCK, or previous course knowledge, at Wellington. Demographically, fewer and fewer students at both institutions come from elite backgrounds. The majority of students now seem to be coming from the middle and the lower classes, but with significant numbers still coming from what they describe as a military background. Doctrinally, both institutions are Army-centric in their orientation, and both appear to teach a very outdated ground doctrine, according to the opinions of the American students that attended both institutions, that is more suited to World War II than on a modern battlefield. They say that they are deficient in what the United States Army would call combined arms operations, which is described as the synchronized and simultaneous applications of the various arms and services to achieve a greater effect than if each were used separately or sequentially. And finally, despite the fact that Wellington is ostensibly a tri-service institution that is committed to inculcating what it calls a sense of jointmanship in all 3 services, perhaps only the more Army-centric Quetta pays less lip service to that notion. It was a standing joke among all the students at DSSC that jointmanship was a Hindi word that was spelled A-R-M-Y. Coming to the differences along the line of inquiry 1 at the 2 institutions, the Pakistan Army is often accused, and certainly was accused at Wellington, of being a Punjabi-dominated force. In fact, my research found that officers at Quetta really mirror the demographics of the nation as a whole. Wellington, however, there are 2 notable exceptions. The Hindu population among the student body is in line with its percentage of the overall population. But I found that Sikhs are overrepresented at a rate 10 times their level of the Indian population, while Muslims are underrepresented by a factor of 20. I also found a higher level of religiosity in Quetta than at Wellington, but it's important to stress that at both institutions, the top finishers, those that are destined to go on to become general officers, are found to be moderate in religion and secular in their attitudes toward the military profession. Turning to some of the other lines of inquiry, I would like to note that the last student interview that I did for the Wellington experience was from a student who was there in 2017. If I were to update the book today, I would likely modify two findings. The first one was in line of inquiry 1, where I said that there was no evidence of what is called Hindutva, a radical Hindu nationalism at DSSC. But I've since learned and have seen growing anecdotal evidence that since the 2019 Modi re-election and other actions of the Indian government that are aimed at the Muslim community in India, this may be changing at DSSC. I had a similar finding in line of inquiry 4, that the DSSC students were mostly apolitical over the 4 decades of the study. But once again, there is growing anecdotal evidence that this may have changed in the last few years. And I would say that both of these findings require further exploration and research before they could be confirmed in any update to the book. I think I'll stop my remarks at this point and turn it over to the reviewers to talk about in more detail the other 4 lines of inquiry of the studies.
Thank you so much, Colonel Smith. I'll now ask each of our reviewers to give us their assessments of the book based on their essays for South Asian Voices. And we'll start with Brigadier Salik, then we'll go to Dr. Reshmi, then Ms. Salia Tasleem, and then to Dr. Aditi. So the floor is yours, Brigadier Salik.
First of all, let me greet the ladies on the panel on the Women's Day. It's a very ladies-heavy panel, so I think probably it was kept in mind because of the date itself. Anyway, I think the first surprise I got was that I was asked to write my review on the Wellington experience rather than writing on the Quetta experience. Whereas I had the personal first-hand experience of Quetta, having spent 2.5 years there. But anyway, it was interesting to read the book on Wellington experience. And in fact, it appeared to me to be a mirror image of what is or could have been the Quetta experience. I agree with Dave Smith that the two institutions have a lot of commonalities. I think it has to do something with the South Asian culture as well as the common heritage of the British Indian Army, which was inherited by both India and Pakistan. And since these institutions were established by the British, so they are carrying forward those traditions. However, I would differ with the view that this kind of a study of one particular institution, however prominent and significant that institution may be, cannot be justifiably extrapolated to draw conclusions about the culture and values and ethos of a very large body of people like the Indian Army or the Pakistani Army. So I think that to me appears to be a bit unfair, because the officer class which is represented in these institutions, one, that they come through a competitive examination, so they are different from the rest of the officers, and they represent, according to Dave, 20 to 25% in my opinion, maybe even less than that, 15 to 20% of the overall strength of the officers class in both Indian and Pakistani armies. So they represent a peculiar class of officers who are professionally better than their counterparts in the rest of the army. And they come to do this course, which is a very high stakes course, because it determines the direction of your future career and your future advancement in the career. Although I would again differ here with Dave that this is not the only criteria for further promotion, because there are other obstacles in between. Also, this determines your direction definitely, but then your performance on command is very important. And then those who show the potential for going to the higher ranks, in Pakistan's case at least, they have to go through the war course and the national defense course. If they don't do that, they cannot become general officers. So it's not this, howsoever better you may have done in staff college, you cannot become a general unless you do that advanced course. And there are many officers who have done very well in the staff course, but because of their performance, which was lacking in some aspects at the war course, they could not make it to the higher ranks, and they ended up as brigadiers. And there are many, many examples like that. Then again, because there is a high stakes environment, you are being observed, all your activities, your behavior, your performance, everything is under the telescope. So people tend to behave rather, I would say, artificially for that period. And they put on a kind of a behavior pattern for that period of time, and they would not normally behave outside the staff colleges, and they would behave during the course at the staff college. So whatever the outside observers see in the behavior patterns of those officers who are their colleagues during the course, that may not be the true reflection of their natural instincts. And as I said earlier, also, that does not reflect the journal standards or ethos or the traditions of the rest of the army. So that has to be very clear in this thing. Then I think somewhere Dave has complained in both the books that as military attaché or the defense representatives or diplomats in the US embassy, they are not allowed free access to the personnel or the units formations. I think that's the case with every country. I don't think so. The Pakistani defense attaché in Washington is allowed free access to the US unit formations or the personnel, whether officers or other ranks. So that I think there has got other implications. So that's why I think every army or every country is bound to have some kind of restrictions on that kind of exchange. So therefore, expecting that you will have free access to all the unit formation to have a real feel of the army may not be possible. So I think that is the best under the circumstances, which could have been done. And I give credit to Dave for using this very unique methodology. And despite the fact that once you spend a year in an institution and in a country, you are bound to develop some affinities, some friendships, and your judgments and your comments are bound to be subjective a little bit. So in that case, I think he's made a great effort to remain objective while drawing his conclusions from the input he got from the officers who underwent those courses. Now, a few other observations which I think Dave has done in all a very good job, but with a person of his experience and exposure, one would have expected still better. The certain instances I have mentioned in my write-up. Also, for instance, the Enterprise incident, which is repeated again and again in the Indian narratives also, and Dave was also mentioning this. And I pointed out that there was a similar naval task force, US naval task force, which had come into the Bay of Bengal to help India during the 62 war with China. And I think there are certain myths which we need to, in these kind of studies, we need to address those and remove those. Similar myths, which Dave has again referred, is about Pakistan as the fastest growing nuclear program. I would just present before you a few figures. In 2002, the SIPRI yearbook said Pakistan had 24 to 48 nuclear weapons, India 30 to 35. In 2010, Pakistan was supposed to have 70 to 90 and India 60 to 80. In 2015, Pakistan was supposed to have 100 to 120 and India 90 to 110. And in 2020, Pakistan is supposed to have 160 and India is supposed to have 150. So over this period of 10, 15, 20 years, the differential between the two has been 10 weapons. So I think this is simple mathematics for everyone to know which is going faster and which is going slower. I think the pace from these figures is exactly the same. So I think these are the kind of myths which we continue to repeat, and well-informed people should in fact challenge and question these myths rather than accepting these as the facts. Again, I think Dave has also pointed out that he would like to revise his views about the apolitical nature of the Indian Army as well as the ethnic balance. He has mentioned the secular credentials, I think virtual disappearance of the Muslims from the Indian Army is very evident from the figures, the gross underrepresentation, and I think there appears to be no effort to address that issue. And this is one of the, I think, major critiques of the Indian Army culture and its credentials as a apolitical, a secular, and a secular body of, or a secular institution. Then I think there's a dimension of lack of attention to the logistics. This is the case with both Wellington and Quetta. The reason, to my mind, is that the policy, the promotion policy and career pattern in our army is that officers who have had the experience of operational appointments or instructional appointments, they are the ones who go into the higher ranks. And officers who have been on the logistic staff appointments, they do not go very high. They end up at best as brigadiers. Very few of them make it to the general rank, even if they are very well qualified and competent officers. That's a shortcoming. But because this culture of emphasis on operational experience or instructional abilities is given preference, that is why once the postings are announced at the end of the course, and those who are going as brigade majors, they celebrate, but those who are going as on the quartermaster side, staff officers, in fact, the people console with them, and their wives literally cry that my husband didn't do well. He's going as a DQ rather than going as brigade major. So that's I think some kind of a cultural problem with both Indian and Pakistani army, that this so much of importance is going. And final point I would like to make is that once we get commissioned in the army, we are handed over a small handbook. The title is Customs of Service. And I think this is traditionally coming down to us from the British times. And one of the customs is that you do not discuss politics and religion in the officers' messes. So that may also explain lack of discussion on religion or politics in Wellington or Quetta, because this is how you are groomed in the military right from the beginning, and that becomes a second habit then. So I would leave rest of my comments in the question answer session if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brigadier Sadiq, and I really appreciate you focusing on both the books, even though you did a review only for one, and we've had a good discussion about the military education and institutional aspects. And now I hope we can transition more to the external, internal threat perceptions of the Army. So I'll ask Dr. Reshmi Kazi to give her comments now.
Thank you, Akriti. A warm, happy Women's Day to everybody. This is such a beautiful way to, have this organized today. And thank you so much, Stimson Center, for having us all here. Of course, I cannot, but my feelings for this will not be complete if I don't share and celebrate this wonderful day with wonderful people, wonderful gentlemen like Brigadier Naim Salik and Colonel David. Of course, when you share it with us, when you acknowledge us, when you regard us, it means so much. And I would like to celebrate this beautiful day with beautiful gentlemen like you. Thank you so much. Now, we all know, presuming that we all are aware of the main lines of inquiry. So I will quickly, get to the point. The most important, to begin with, Colonel Dave, your conclusions that you have drawn on the various lines of inquiry, the most important takeaway that is that they have certain kind of negative implications for the South Asian regional stability out here. Now, you're right to some extent, definitely that aspect of the negative instability for the region is there. And to begin with, on the Indo-US front, that is the strategic partnership that you have mentioned, you have pointed out that there is a continual mistrust. And of course, this stems basically from the, the continual kind of the mistrust, of course, is basically stemming from the fact that the US-Pakistan relationship, the way they have, evolved over the years. And not to forget the 1971 USS Enterprise incident, which has had an impact over generations. And I have written that it's somehow, unpardonable, because it was an act of nuclear intimidation, and something which we have, read over the years. And I'm sure the generations to come who are specializing in the subject, they will be also, significantly influenced with this single act. But apart from that, there are other issues which, does create, as you said, the mistrust factor. And this, of course, stems from the imbalanced trade, the H-1B visa programs, and of course, the Indo-Russian defense ties. But even though you have made your, these are very authentic and genuine issues in this partnership, we cannot also underestimate the length of the Indo-US strategic partnership, which has undergone, particularly in the last 15 years. So we have witnessed the 2005, the global partnership. We have also seen the recently declassified US strategic framework for Indo-Pacific in 2020. And that basically, it outlines the common interest that both these, democracies they have in the Asia-Pacific region. And that calls for enormous cooperation, that has room for enormous cooperation amongst these two democracies. Yes, there are concerns. There are friction points, potential friction points, particularly over the issue of future war with China and or Pakistan for that matter. But then India does hold a prominent place in the global political sphere, and its military equations with other countries definitely will be determined independently. But of course, despite the achievements that had this relationship, irrespective of the frictions, of course, that the achievements that we have achieved, there is still room to further invest and recalibrate this relationship. And I believe non-traditional threats. This is a very important area. It has a gamut of potential. In terms of vaccine development, climate change, and now with the new administration coming up in the US, a lot of expectations are there. How much of that will be materialized? Of course, there's skepticism, but yes, the hope is there, the optimism is there. Technology cooperation, that is again another area where India and US, they can cooperate enormously. We have China factor, that is another area, where there's a potential area where strategic convergences are there, and as a China is a major threat. It is perceived in that manner, which you have also projected, you have opined, and that gives a lot of space where again India and the US can cooperate in terms of strategic interests are concerned. There are genuine stakes there. But of course, as I have also written that despite the problems that are there between India and China, we are also, as the US policy is, the managing, like you cannot really, the idea is not to provoke situations which are not in the interest of these nations, not regionally and not even internationally, because it has impact in the longer run, in the larger security sphere. If we see, it has huge implications. So with China, of course, we are the recent standoff in Ladakh, irrespective of that, there have been progress, there have been dialogues, an amicable solution has been reached. So yes, there are potential areas of friction, but there are areas of convergences as well. And it's how both the nations, India and China, how they work it out. This is, it's going to be characterized with a lot of cooperation from both sides. With Pakistan, of course, it has been a very difficult relationship, no doubt about that. There has been the TNWs and accumulated outrage over the proxy wars that have been going on for a long time now. They have been very strong, they have created very strong friction points in the relationship. The very fact that Pakistan's own domestic issues again makes it a very unstable state, but India's stake would be that that the Pakistan, there is amelioration of relationship, or rather the situation internally, and that would be very much in India's favor, because no country would like to have an unstable state on its borders. And then on the internal threats issue, yes, as you have pointed out again, that India's military has yet to completely quell any of its insurgencies. And I have my points of disagreement there, because on the Khalistan issue, Mizoram insurgency and Nagaland conflict, India has been able to neutralize these conflicts substantially. Yes, the Kashmir issue does prolong. It is a protracted and prolonged combat zone. There has been, we have seen domestic militancy, which is evident because of the insurgency that has been going on for a long time now. Pakistan has been waging guerrilla warfare in Kashmir as part of its foreign policy objectives. And Pakistan's use of these violent non-state actors, it is becoming a very strong inhibiting factor in stabilizing regional peace and security. And also normalization of peace and stability in the region. Yes, there have, because of the insurgency, which has been going on. There has been counterinsurgency policy which India has been following. Yes, there are a lot of criticism against that, which you have also pointed out. But in a combat zone which has witnessed a protracted conflict, there are certain costs such regions they do bear. Unfortunately, those costs have to be they have been borne in this region. But again, to say that the WAM, that is winning hearts and mind policy, that has not worked out, or the Indian Army has not done enough, I would again disagree on that, because there, particularly with the revocation of Article 370, efforts have been intensified to placate the people, to please the people, because there has been some sort of a degree of, a substantial degree of kind of dissatisfaction, and to address that, there have been several outreach programs like Operation Sadbhavna, Mission Reach Out, and Civic Action Program. But of course, to make these programs more effective, it is important that there's a perception battle that has to be won from the Indian side. Much more effort has to be made, and at the same time, there has to be curtailment of terrorist activities to let peace prevail in Kashmir. The next category, that is the state and the institutions. Again, you have pointed out that the students are consistently political, but that is, this approach is very much part of our the culture that is very much embedded within the army here, and probably this is one important factor. This approach has facilitated the army's the role that army plays, in facilitating civic administration as well as the security goals. This is an army. Indian Army is when we talk about army, of course, it's a demonstration of force, but the force is used only as the last resort. This is an army for the people and of the people. So to achieve that, to remain apolitical is very much an important aspect. And this is the model of objective control that Indian Army has to adhere to, so that wherein the politicians define the strategic objectives, and the objective, basically the aim of the Indian Army is to achieve those objectives with the least obstruction. That is how it goes here in this part, rather in India. On the nuclear
if I could stop you right there, and maybe we can come back to the nuclear issues in the Q&A. I just want to make sure that we can get all the other speakers in as well. So far we've had a conversation mostly about the Wellington experience that's focused on the Indian Army, and now we want to turn to more discussion of the Quetta experience, and I will ask Ms. Sadia Taslim to give her presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Akriti and Stimson Center for putting this together. And thanks for making me a part of such a wonderful panel. I'm very happy to see some familiar names in the participants list as well. Given the paucity of time, let me jump straight to my comments on Colonel David Smith's rigorous work on the attitudes and perceptions of Pakistani Army officers at the Command and Staff College, Quetta. I'll make two quick points and leave the rest for question and answer session, just to make sure that I don't overstep the time limit. Let me start by acknowledging that I found Colonel Smith's account of the training at the college very insightful, particularly his observations about the curriculum and the training methodology. Now, coming to my points, my first point pertains to Colonel Smith's prediction of high likelihood of stasis in the Pakistan Army's attitude on key issues relating domestic politics and foreign policy. I see that his prediction is embedded in his study of the institutional norms, practices, and training modules at the Staff College. He notes that there has been little change in the curriculum and training over the past 4 decades, and that the general behavioral patterns have also remain more or less the same because of a fairly rigid set of expectations from the students when it comes to thinking about strategy and technical problems and problem solving. I do find a lot of merit in this argument, and I completely agree that institutional practices can reproduce and reinforce existing beliefs, and they do foster the kind of stasis that Colonel Smith predicts. But I also think that as much as the structural realities of the college life are important, so are all the other social forces and structures that the officers engage with, including the life in the public or civilian sphere, and the exposure to the transnational social institutions, particularly social media in the contemporary world. And I say this based on my experiential learning from teaching at the Quetta University. Over the last decade, I have observed a lot of variation in the attitudes and beliefs of the student body, including students from the armed forces, on questions pertaining to foreign policy and to domestic politics. And I've also noticed a fairly high degree of intellectual uncertainty, or what we may call fluidity. I think that's a widespread phenomena across the world these days. And if we think about that, I think if anything, it leaves very little room for stagnation. Of course, determining the likely direction of change would require extensive research on contemporary social trends in and outside the military institutions, and not just the staff college, but also like all the other institutions, mainly the National Defense University. But to me, stasis or stagnation doesn't like really appear sustainable, particularly when it comes to officers' attitudes toward the role of the military as an institution, domestic politics, relations with China, and attitudes toward nuclear weapons. Again, like all of these issue areas are fairly sort of tense, and one can speak about these issues at length. But I'll try to just keep my comments limited to the domestic political front. I think the ongoing social and political movements in Pakistan are unlikely to go unnoticed by the young army officers. Now, how do these affect them is yet to be seen. And the change in their attitudes can be progressive or regressive, but I do foresee some change. My second point pertains to Colonel Smith's observations regarding the attitudes vis-a-vis India. Colonel Smith foresees positive change in young officers' attitudes toward India, mainly arguing that the internal threat looms larger in young officers' perceptions because of their operational experiences participating in the military operations in erstwhile Fata region, Swat and Balochistan, and the fact that a lot of them have seen combat from such a close proximity, and they have lost their friends and people from their units, has a deep sort of psychological, emotional impact. And of course, I don't want to undermine or dismiss the important implications that these experiences could have. But I do not necessarily share Colonel Smith's perspective on when he argues that these threats have relegated the India threat to a backseat. And the reason why I don't share this assertion is because I don't see a binary between internal and external threat perceptions as far as the perceptions within the armed forces are concerned. I assume that my hunch is that the Pakistan Army sees the internal threat more often as an extension of the India threat. Hence, we see the repeated mentioning of dossiers containing information on state-sponsored acts of terrorism, and accusations against dissident movements of working on India's behest. This does not mean that Pakistan's India policy is not already changing or will not change, but I see that the sources of that change lie elsewhere, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about that in the Q&A, particularly keeping in view the recent announcement on ceasefire. I hope that I have finished within time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yes, we will come back to both those points in the Q&A. And let me now turn to Dr. Azima Malhotra for her set of comments, and then we'll jump into some questions.
Thank you so much, Akriti. Let me begin by thanking the Stimson Center, you, Brigitta, Hamna, for helping me shape the article as it is and my views on the whole thing. So the book was really interesting. Every time I read it, I was like, oh yeah, I've heard these statements from colleagues in Pakistan, and I also found the similarities between the Quetta experience and the Wellington experience, which I happened to just briefly look through because I have fond memories of Wellington, where I did a part of my schooling when my father was posted there. So looking at the Quetta experience, I kind of went along with the conventional wisdom that the institutional perspectives, in this case, the perceptions of the Pakistan Army, largely tend to get mirrored in the external policy or the internal policy of that country. And I find a lot of examples that come out from the book. So let me begin with, the aspect of external threats and friendships. So India, of course, that was a no-brainer. I wasn't expecting anything very different. So there is an anti-India stance within the Pakistan Army, which is predictable, and therefore we do see an inimical Indian policy. What was interesting was, the point that the junior officers from the Pakistan Air Force and the Pakistan Navy do not seem to be that stringent on the anti-India sentiment. I'm not saying that they are pro-India, but the kind of vehemence which you see in the Pakistan Army, it is much lesser in the junior officers of the Pakistan Navy and the Pakistan Air Force. That was something notable and quite interesting for me. When it comes to the US, again, we see how, the Pakistan Army officers, they tend to look at the US as an erratic and an unreliable partner. And they tend to kind of, go back to the whole Pressler sanctions and how they have since then felt that the US has used Pakistan Army for its own purposes. And again, that's why we see the reluctance of the Pakistan Army to embrace the US as a partner, or even side with them on the counterterrorism strategies. Another very interesting aspect, which kind of answered a lot of questions for me, were in the China section. So it was interesting to see, and a very logical finding, that even though when it comes to the political rhetoric and the narrative, China and Pakistan, they talk about the higher than mountains, sweeter than honey kind of friendship, the brotherly love, which seems to not exist anywhere else, but between Pakistan and China. What was interesting is that within the Pakistan Army, the officers seem to be much more pragmatic about, the relation between China and Pakistan. They do not believe the whole high end, the high drama rhetoric about them being the best friends, which is really interesting because they understand that China and Pakistan are in this equation for their self-interests and not because of some brotherly love, which explains why we do not see a lot of opposition coming from within Pakistan or from within the Pakistan Army on the developments in Xinjiang, and how it also impacts some of the Pakistani families. And we see events like Pakistani women being sold as brides to China, and those investigations were closed by Pakistan. So that kind of shows that Pakistan does not really see China as a brother, but understands that both of them are for their self-interest. And that is why it's willing to kind of go along with China where it thinks, they have convergences, and stay shut on aspects where they realize that there are divergences. In terms of the internal security threats, again, one of the most interesting things which I came across was, how some of the junior officers tend to see internal threats as kind of, looming larger and more tangible as compared to the India threat. Although I get where you're coming from, as to how the whole internal security threat is more imminent, is more of an experiential reality for a lot of officers and their units. However, as Sadia kind of stated, that it's unlikely to kind of fade out the whole India threat, like the India threat will remain as like the standard threat for Pakistan, although the internal threat may kind of boggle them down specifically at specific times, but the India threat will continue to be the main priority for the establishment and for the officers. Another interesting thing which came across in the book was how the curriculum of the staff college changed in Pakistan, and how it started slowly and reluctantly kind of they embraced the whole aspect of subconventional warfare. And what was interesting, how there is more focus on kinetic operations against militants and less focus on the aspect of winning hearts and minds of the civilian population, which I kind of do see when we look at the Zarb-e-Azb and the Radul Fazad. In these operations, we do see a lot of human rights violations, and I do see you kind of echoing similar sentiments in the Wellington experience of how the officers from the staff college kind of looked at subconventional operations. And lastly, I have one thing to speak about how the Pakistan Army looks at the state and the civilian governance. One thing which I kind of surmised from the book was even though we have a lot of support for military governance within Pakistan Army, largely because they look at the civilians as corrupt, as uneducated, and they feel as a result, Pakistan is not ready for a Western style democracy. Interestingly, I have heard these views from a lot of my Pakistani colleagues, specifically from the military, who do say that, oh yeah, we're willing to give a chance to the civilians if they, if they were educated or if they were good enough, which kind of shows how, within, the internal perspective is still that the military is giving them a chance, which kind of states that the military is the one still calling the shots. So one pattern which kind of, I surmised from your findings was that whenever the military is in power, whenever there's a coup and the military is in power, the support for civilian governance within the Pakistan Army kind of comes about as soon as the repetition of the Pakistan Army starts getting deteriorated. Until and unless, the repetition of the institution is intact, the officers are quite happy to see a military governance. But as soon as the repetition of the institution starts getting impacted, again, that's what I perceived, that they tend to be more open to the idea of having civilian governance. So these are some of my points. I can speak on other aspects, but I think I'll leave that for the Q&A so that I don't kind of cross the 4-5 minutes mark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aditi. Colonel Smith, I wonder if you want to respond to a few of the remarks made so far before we go into more of a Q&A and discussion.
I'll make a couple of general comments. And I'd like to open the aperture a little bit. I mean, we've had 4 reviews, and the reviews, we've really not had enough time to go into all of the aspects of each of the lines of inquiry. Probably since the book, The Wellington Experience, has been out, it's almost 6 months now, I've probably had a dozen reviews from various places, mostly in India, quite frankly. And they've been far more harsh and pillorying than the 4 reviewers that I've had today. And I'd like to take on a couple of general comments that have come from the other reviews in this segment, and I'll try to be brief. But basically, I'd like to make 2 comments. And one is about the methodology that I used. And it was rightly pointed out by Brigadier Salek, how can you take a few, the remarks of some of these students about the Indian or the Pakistani officers they've seen and make, general statements about the Army as an institution. I guess I would say about that, it's because of what these staff colleges do in creating the conditions for people to be promoted to the highest levels of the Army. It is the top 10% of both institutions that become the general officers, and they in turn are the ones that set the tone for the wider Army. So their views and attitudes about different things are what becomes the high level senior officer views, and that is what pervades the Army. But let me go a little deeper. Here's what the basic arguments have been about my methodology that have been much harsher than expressed today. They say that the sample is too small, that the American students are too junior, that they are not intellectually mature, that they are linguistically challenged and don't understand the impact of the local culture on what they're seeing and hearing. Other people have said that, you know, in India and Pakistan, people are skilled at keeping things from foreigners that they don't want them to talk about. And therefore, a lot of the true nature of what they've seen has gone over their heads. Well, I was interviewed by Force magazine in India, and they made all of these comments to me and says, well, how do you respond? And I'll give you the same answer that I gave to Force magazine. I said, this criticism reminds me of the well-known quote by the American poet and historian Carl Sandburg, who once observed, and this is a quote, if the facts are against you, you have to argue the law. If the law is against you, you have to argue the facts. And if the law and the facts are both against you, then you just pound the table and yell like hell. Or in this case, you question the methodology if you don't like the findings. So to the critics, I would say, look, who is better placed to understand the attitudes and values of the Pakistan Army and the Indian Army than the people who spend an entire year, 24/7, working in the classroom, working in their homes, working over the weekends and long-term exercises? Is it our diplomats? I can assure you that that is not the case. Diplomats in Islamabad and in New Delhi have almost no contact with the Indian military at all, except occasionally in the context of meetings with very senior officers in very stilted settings. Is it our military attachés? I was a military attaché in Pakistan for 6 years. I can tell you that my access was much less than the access of any of the students that we had at Quetta. And I've talked with 5 or 6 Indian attachés in our embassy in New Delhi, and they would tell me the same things. So what's a better approach? Another comment is, well, you know, you should have interviewed serving Indian and Pakistani military officers about these things, to which, you know, apologies to Brigadier Naeem, that is never going to happen in either country. That would never be permitted. No military attaché, no foreign researcher is going to be able to sit down and talk about sensitive subjects like that with Pakistani or Indian military officers. It just can't happen. And even if it did, let's assume that it did happen, what would I get? I would get a very narrow set of opinions in a very narrowly constricted time frame. And that was never my purpose in writing these books. I wanted to take a look at change over time. I did not want to get one snapshot in that time. So I'm not trying to be defensive about the methodology. I've pointed out in both books the weaknesses of the methodology and the fact that, yes, I understand. I'm only talking about the top 25% of the officer corps. We will never have the opportunity to know what the attitudes are of the other 75, nor will we know the attitudes of the junior commissioned officers, nor will we know the attitudes of the soldiers. But it's the best that we can do. Now, the second general criticism that I've had about the book is the nuclear. And we haven't really gotten into nuclear here, and I hope we will get into that in a lot more detail. But the basic criticism is, well, you don't understand the nature of Indian deterrence. To which I point out in the book, and I'll point out here, I think this attitude is based on 3 erroneous assumptions. 1, that Pakistan is always going to be a rational actor, and therefore it knows that if it ever uses nuclear weapons against India, it'll be destroyed. 2, because of this, Pakistan is only bluffing about its use of tactical nuclear weapons in the event of a future war with India. And 3, even if it's not bluffing, the Indian Army is so big that it can fight through, an NBC environment and prevail. I could not disagree more with any of these three assumptions. And I try to go into that in great detail in both books. The attitude is the same in both sides. And here's the point. Both sides are engaged in ramping up the production of nuclear weapons. Both sides are deploying a triad, a nuclear triad. And yet at neither institution, neither at Quetta, neither at Wellington, are the ramifications of these things ever discussed by the people who in the future are going to be the operators of these nuclear systems. That's my point. I'll stop there and we'll go on to the next segment.
Thank you so much, Colonel Smith. I will get to audience questions soon. We already have some really great questions in the Q&A box. So if you have any more thoughts, comments, questions that you would want to put in there, please go ahead and do that. But before I open up the floor to the audience, I want to ask a few questions of my own, just 2 to 3. We've spoken about this a little bit, but I wanted to drill down further into perceptions of China within the Indian student body that you studied, Colonel Smith, at Wellington. And I also want to bring in Dr. Kazi and Dr. Malhotra if they want to come in on this. But specifically, Colonel Smith, you observed in the book that the Wellington students exhibited an ambivalence in their perceptions of China, and that many students identified China as a competitor to India, but were reluctant to call it an enemy or a serious threat. Do you think this assessment would still hold weight today? Because, as I understand, the book was written before the Doklam standoff happened in 2017, and obviously the current standoff that began in May 2020, which has evoked a really strong elite and public sentiment against China. And we've seen very specific actions by the Indian government in terms of economic restrictions, as well as the deployment of troops and armor along the LAC. So the question is, would you revise this finding today, or would you expect to find different perceptions of China now? And I also want, like I said, Dr. Kazi and Dr. Malhotra to come in on this, on sort of what their perception is on the ground. Colonel Smith?
Sure. My short answer to that is no. I think you have to look at Foreign Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar's recently published book, which is called The India Way. He offers an argument that forecloses any hope that India is someday going to be an ally of the United States. He says that India's grand strategy requires, and this is a quote from the book, advancing national interests by identifying and exploiting opportunities created by global contradictions to extract as much gains from as many ties as possible. And therefore, because India is weaker right now militarily than China, it has to expand its national capabilities by, quote, leveraging the external environment to address these bilateral balances. I think if you read this book and you consider the implications, it shows really what Indian foreign policy is all about. And of course, he's a serving foreign minister, and therefore his book obviously has the approval of the prime minister. All of this sounds like a return to 19th century balance of power politics. And you'll probably remember that a British Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, once observed that we have no eternal enemies and we have no we have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. So I think this governs the relations that India has both with the United States and with China. I don't want to go into much here because I want to hear what the others have to say, but I don't know if they would agree with my characterization of this. But it just shows me that India is going to, I don't want to say this in a negative way, but it sounds to me like with both the United States and China, India wants to have its cake and to eat it too. And therefore, it's willing to accommodate both if the situation requires it. And it's willing to change if the situation requires that over time. We'll have to see how this plays out. One might think that the situation in Ladakh would have changed India's perception of China from that of a competitor to something a little more of an enemy. But I'm not sure that's going to be the case. And certainly it seems that if you take a look at Jai Shankar's book, he's signaling that that will not be the case.
Thanks, Colonel Smith. And I wonder if Aditi or Reshmi agree with that characterization, especially because we have seen, Foreign Minister Jaishankar also say that the border standoff has profoundly disturbed the relationship and has really impacted the relationship. And some of this language that we've seen from him has been very strong and very unlike what we've heard previous foreign ministers say about the India-China relationship, especially the candidness on what has gone on. So do you agree with the Colonel Smith's characterizations there? Aditi, you first, maybe?
Yeah, thanks. So I will not say I completely disagree with what Colonel Smith says, but I would like to point out that, again, there's a difference between how the public kind of perceives something and how the government looks at something. So of course, when it talks about the public, can you hear me? Sorry, there was some background noise. Okay, so so there's a difference between how the government looks at things and how the public, which also includes, again, the militaries, how they look at it. In terms of the perception of China, yes, I think the element of trust has kind of dissipated to a great extent. The way we in India looked at China has kind of changed, because for a long time, the strategic community kept saying that don't look at Pakistan as the ultimate threat. It is not, it's China which is the ultimate threat. And this has been going on for the 90s. And nobody seemed to be kind of, accepting it. Even now, I would say, despite Doklam and despite, the recent clashes that took place, the change is subtle. It's not per say very dramatic. Like, you will not see India not cooperating with China, because when it comes to the government, as Colonel Smith said, the government is smart enough to know what is in its own self-interest. The Indian government realizes, for good or bad, that's debatable, realizes that so far the idea of multi-alignment, which again should not be confused with non-alignment, the idea of multi-alignment seems to be benefiting India in a lot of aspects. And that is why it does not want to ally with one side and kind of, make any one side the enemy or a complete friend. So when it comes to China, even though we see high rhetoric, we do see India kind of going all out, when it comes to how the ministers are speaking about it, how the government is dealing with it. But there is still a nuance. We will still see India cooperating with China on a lot of aspects. We most recently have been seeing India actually ink a lot of, economic cooperations and, economic deals with China, even though on one front we are fighting. Again, another example would be India is vehemently against the CPEC and has refused to endorse the Belt and Road Initiative. However, we still see India as one of the largest, borrowers from the AIIB Bank. So India will continue to balance wherever it's necessary. But yes, the public perception towards China has shifted towards a more negative stance. I think so.
Go ahead, Rashmi.
Thanks, Aditi. Yes, I could not agree with you. What you are saying more than what you just pointed out. There is an element of bellicosity underlying the relationship. It has been badly, particularly the recent standoff that we've had. It has had a negative impact, and I think this is going to be there for a period of time. It's not going to go, not at least in the near future. But we have to also, if we trace the relationship that which India-China has had. For instance, you've had Chumar in 2014, Birdsey in 2015, Doklam 2017. All these, instances, there have been, the Doklam incident, it went on for almost 70 days. There were border issues, border skirmishes that was going on. There was high tensions. This tension was also very serious. There were fears of escalation with the nuclear angle also there in the picture. There was a huge concern. So this bellicosity has been there. But as Aditi pointed out, and this is where probably I will agree with Colonel Smith, his characterization. that there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. I mean, what is permanent is your interest. So here in this case, in economic cooperation, both sides are aware how much important it is, the trading bloc, which is opening into not only in the region, but also Southeast Asia, South Asia, in general. And overall, it is a huge, investment where both India and China, they can invest in, and which will be in their own interest. So if that pertains to, having the cake and eating it, I mean, that is how, if government is working, Indian government is working it out, and China also sees it that way, there's nothing wrong in that. Besides, what I also see is that there are irritants on both sides, which are both are aware of. But at the same time, one also has to take into account that there is an element of distrust. There is an environment of huge negativity. China, for that matter, has never, unilaterally made that kind of conditions or concessions where India can enhance that trust factor or that confidence. There has not been, those kind of efforts are not there. In fact, the discourse is like China always, has a shifting stand. But then, as I said, even the recent Ladakh, standoff and the dialogue that both these nations came to, it shows that they have the interest in coming to an amicable solution. They have common interests. There are strategic convergences, and it can be characterized by antagonistic cooperation, but still cooperation is there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Aditi, maybe we'll come back. I'm so sorry. We should move on to the next question. So we've had a little bit of discussion on the India-China aspect, and I think wanted to turn a little bit to Pakistan. And this is a conversation we were having earlier, and I think this was sort of a through line in many of the remarks that were made today about what Colonel Smith has observed in the Quetta experience about a generational divide between the Pakistani army officers, where the junior and mid-grade officers tend to think of it, internal security challenges posed by extremist groups as more immediate and salient than the military threat from India. So I want to put this question to Colonel Smith, but also want to bring Brigadier Salik and Mr. Saleem into this, and maybe push a little bit on what has been said earlier. I mean, I think one is, how do you think this perception has evolved since 2014, when the cutoff point for that book? Because especially if you consider the increased instability in Afghanistan and the challenges that a spillover of violence from there would mean for Pakistan, and additionally, specifically for the future, in the face of resource constraints that Pakistan faces because of its severe economic crisis and the pressure that puts on military deployments and defense modernization, and India's likely increased military focus on the border with China going forward rather than Pakistan, is there likely to be a reduction of the salience of the Indian threat from Pakistan's point of view? Colonel Smith, maybe quickly, if you could go first, and then Brigadier Salik and Ms. Salia the same.
If I were going to update the Quetta experience today, I would probably change that finding. You have to recall that the finding was made in 2014 originally. I updated it slightly in the preface to the book, which came out in 2018, but the direction wasn't really clear. So really, over time, two things have changed regarding Pakistan's threat perception. And the first is the internal security situation in Pakistan has gotten a lot better. And at the same time, certainly the events of 2019 have created even more salience about the external threat posed by India, talking about, what happened at Pulwama and Balakot, talking about Article 370 and all of the other things that the Indian government has taken that are seen as against the interests of the Muslim community in that country. So I would say that there probably is no generational difference any longer between younger officers and senior officers about the salience of the threat. I believe both would agree that the most salient threat is the India threat. Afghanistan is an interesting situation. I found in the Quetta experience, again in 2014, that Pakistan considered the United States to be a military threat, primarily because of the size the troops footprint that we had in the country at that time created the potential for interfering with Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. Well, we have 2,500 soldiers in Afghanistan. We may have 0 in May, depending on what the Biden administration decides to do. So I would say by no stretch of the imagination can anybody in Pakistan consider 2,500 troops, most of whom are headquarters personnel, to constitute a military threat against Pakistan any longer. So I would say that is no longer a salient finding as well. Thank you.
Enrique de Sale?
I think we have to see the time frame that is very important, because the internal threat started building up in Pakistan from 2006-07 onwards. Before that, it wasn't there. And then a period of about a decade between 2006 to 2016, it was at the peak. And currently, as Quetta Smith has also pointed out, the internal security situation is radically different from what it was in 5-6 years ago, particularly after the Operation Zarb-e-Azb. So there are isolated incidents, very minor nature here and there. But unlike the situation in those years when no place was safe, even the major cities like Lahore, Karachi, Islamabad, there were lots of incidents. So those are no more there. So there is a great change. So obviously those people, the young officers who immediately after getting their commission were sent into the units who were operating in that internal security operational environment, they had to be influenced by that kind of environment. Some of them, in fact, by the time they became majors, they had 2 to 3 tours of duty in that operational area. But at the same time, we also have to remember that Indian threat never receded. All this time, particularly from 2014 onwards, the incidence of cross-LOC firings have been multiplied. And not only the frequency, but also the intensity of the firing has increased over these years. So therefore, that attention was never lost. That was always there. And that should also speak, I think, the point which was made at some stage by someone, that Pakistan Air Force and Pakistan Navy do not have that kind of attitude towards India as the Pakistan Army, because Pakistan Army is deployed on the line of control, which is a live water and faces the bullets day in and day out. So obviously their outlook about India would be definitely very different from Pakistan Air Force and Navy, who are farther behind, who do not confront the Indians on 24/7 basis. So that should be the reason for this. So this situation has now changed. And even as Sadia had mentioned earlier, even the internal security threat is not de-linked from the Indian threat, because there is a very strong perception, and there is some evidence to suggest as well that Indians making use of their presence in Afghanistan have been helping these insurgent groups who were carrying out these kind of actions in KPK and parts of Balochistan. So it cannot be de-linked really from the Indian threat. So it is considered to be an extension of the Indian threat, and the capture of that Indian naval officer Kulbhushan from Balochistan and those kind of incidents, and the recent dossier which Pakistan prepared. So these are all pointing towards the fact that it is subsumed in the overall larger Indian threat. And India threat is obviously, it is because of the capabilities. It's not because of the intentions. Intentions can change anytime. And with the tensions between China and India on the Ladakh border, that has not eased the pressure or tensions on the line of control, because India has sufficient forces to separately deploy on the China borders without taking out any troops from the line of control. So the manning level at the line of control has remained the same despite the confrontation at Ladakh border, and mind you, that confrontation is minuscule as compared to the one against Pakistan, because one, that geography is prohibitive on the India-China border. Secondly, what happened in Doklam? There's a lot of talk about Doklam. What happened in Doklam? Indian and Chinese soldiers, they were pushing each other, and no weapons were used. And in Ladakh also, they used sticks and iron rods to fight. No bullets were fired at each other. So I think that is the nature of clashes between India and China. And if you compare it with line of control, there are all kinds of weapons are fired, including heavy artillery and mortars and everything.
Sadia, a couple of quick thoughts before we move to some audience questions.
I don't really have much to add here. I think I agree with, Colonel Smith has already responded to some of the points that I had raised in my review, and Brigadier Sadiq has expanded on the question vis-a-vis the India-China dynamics. I think I completely agree with Colonel Smith's perspective on the Pakistan-US relationship. I think the US, the threat perception vis-a-vis the United States has completely receded now. In the public discourse, it was fairly pronounced from the year 2009 to 2011, 11-12, but there isn't really any conversation about any threat from the United States in the contemporary discourse. And as far as India is concerned, I think that has been taken care of.
Thank you, Sadia. And I'll forego my last question for now and take some audience questions. So Colonel Smith, for you from Nirmal Verma, how would you assess the views of the students at both the colleges towards nuclear deterrence?
That's a very hard thing to assess, because that's a subject that was taboo at both institutions. And I think primarily for the same reason. About the only thing that you could glean in their attitudes toward deterrence is what you could glean from guest speakers that occasionally would come and talk about the issue. But as I point out in both books, there were very few guest speakers that discussed the subject of any nuclear issues at all. I think I've already answered, at least I think I've answered the question. You know, the view of deterrence, at least on the Indian side, seems to be based on these three, in my view, fallacious assumptions that I've already gone through, so I won't repeat them. I would say on the Pakistan, one attitude that I did find that was curious was somehow the belief among students that if Pakistan were to use a nuclear weapon against Indian forces on Pakistani soil, somehow that would insulate them from an Indian retaliation, which I think is, of course, contradicted by India's stated nuclear policy. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to add any thoughts on that, or should we move on to the next question? Brigadier Saleh?
Yeah, I think one thing I would like to add to what Colonel Smith has said, that yes, we have been nuclear powers for over 2 decades now, and the content and the time assigned for nuclear studies in our military institutions is not adequate, in my personal opinion. That may be my personal opinion at all. Although in Pakistan, the nuclear factor since 1999 has been played in war games at the National Defense University in the National Security War course, and it is studied there, but still there is not enough attention being given to that. I feel that more time could be assigned. Certainly in staff college, the time assigned to this is not enough, and there needs to be additional coaching on this. That is the reason that in general terms, if you go outside SPD and the strategic forces commands, you will find very few officers who have a real deep understanding of these issues. So I think that explains once if you talk to officers who are not conversant with the deterrence theory or nuclear strategy or nuclear policy of our own country, even their answers would not really reflect the thinking of the army, because this is considered to be a specialized area confined to a few selected people and not disseminated to the units and formations. And that's why probably it's not considered necessary to discuss all these things with everyone who may or may not be required to deal with these things in any future contingents.
Thank you, Brigadier Sadiq. So it seems like we've answered a lot of the audience questions, which is great, but I did want to pose my last question then, because I think it's really important and underscores this conversation well about the recent announcement of a ceasefire agreement between India and Pakistan. And we'll do very brief, like quick fire comments from each of you on what factors do you think motivated each side to pursue this agreement at this time, and what does it mean for the future of the relationship? Sadia, maybe we'll start with you and then go to Rashmi, Aditi, and then Brigadier Sadiq.
Well, I'll try to be as brief as possible. I think this from Pakistan, it's clearly a very welcome development, but it's not enough on its own. It has to be followed by a lot of other substantive steps. If they're not taken, probably it would not mean anything. And we really do not have sufficient information at this point as to what exactly transpired this process. But I think from how I see things in Pakistan, I think for Pakistan, the biggest incentive is Pakistan's economic challenge that has, over the past few years, there has been a very clear realization inside Pakistan that this tension with India is not sustainable in economic terms and financial terms, and that there has to be some kind of, we have to pursue some kind of sort of stalemate, or if there is a chance of improving ties, we have to pursue that. I think that explains Pakistani side. I can't really speak on what transpired on the Indian side.
Rashmi, quick comments, maybe just a minute.
Thanks, Akriti there. Well, understandably, no country, they cannot run by rhetoric. So one important aspect of this ceasefire, this CFC declaration that has come off late, is there are specific dates which are mentioned here, that the February 24th and 25th, those are the dates which have been mentioned from where this the ceasefire since then it has been put into effect. So it is a significant. Earlier we did not find these dates in the ceasefire agreements that were made. This is a welcome development because it is I believe it's a significant military measure by India and Pakistan towards the realization of the fact that you cannot really have a situation where violence is going out of control. Moreover, it is also an approach we can see towards conflict management. It's not going to help both the nations. As Sadia also rightly pointed out, there's an economic situation which Pakistan is facing right now, and it is not also in India's favor to indulge, particularly with the COVID, the pandemic situation. The economy is still to come out of it. The shock that we have already absorbed, we have to still come out of it. So at this point of time, letting violence go out of control, that is not really in the interest of both these neighbors. So it makes sense to extend a hand of peace in all directions. And moreover, which is, I think, the most important takeaway that you can take from, that emerges from here is that it is setting the stage for dialogue. And it is also setting the stage where there are such ugly concerns which are emerging both in India as well as, on the international front, that there can be a two-front war where India can get boxed between Pakistan and China. So to take care of one part of the border situation, obviously it's a strategic move.
Thanks, Rashmi. Aditi?
I'll just say that I kind of totally agree with what Rashmi said. So just one statement I'd like to add to this. I think from India's point of view, India thought that they are at a stable situation, as in a situation which India is fine with, because a lot of what Pakistan has been doing did not prove to be a success from Indian point of view. After the whole thing, the changing status of Kashmir, you saw, immense backlash from Pakistan. And I think Pakistan realized it was futile, not going anywhere. And I think India, with the tit for tat, strategy which it has been playing for a few years, I think it has realized that this is a situation which is, this is ideal at best. It can't get any better for India and could only get worse. And with other considerations, as Rashmi pointed out, I think this is the best bet for both sides, frankly. That's where I'll stop.
Thank you so much. Brigadier Salek?
I think economic factor has been mentioned. It's not only Pakistan. I think India is in dire economic trouble since the COVID-19 problem. So I think India is equally under economic pressure. Secondly, I think despite all the bravado and the statements coming from the Indian Army Chief and the CDS about India's capability of fighting a two-front war, and the collusive threat between China and Pakistan and all those kinds of statements. But I think the Indians have also realized that as long as that problem at Ladakh is not resolved, they cannot continue to have another live front. So that's why they wanted to cool off. So from their point of view, that is important. From Pakistani perspective, I think the important aspect is that while on the Indian side, there is a belt along the line of control where there is no civilian population. They are a little farther away from the line of control. On Pakistani side, they are right on the zero line. And I think the frequent firing incidents were taking a heavy toll of the civilians on the Pakistani side. And it was to give relief to those by having the ceasefire. I think those civilians will have a sigh of relief. And lastly, I think, as was mentioned by someone, I think Sadia probably, that it is not enough by itself. If you go by 2003 ceasefire, it was followed by the initiation of the composite dialogue in 2004. So I think this will not last very long on its own. It has to be supported by other confidence building measures and maybe resumption of some kind of dialogue. And we are already hearing some news of some talk of sending the high commissioners back to the respective capitals. So maybe those kind of developments we may see in the coming days.
Thank you so much, Brigadier Salek. We're out of time. We're actually over time, but I want to give Colonel Smith the last word and also mention that there have been some comments in the Q&A box about, what are the views of the present generation of officers on Balakot and post-Pulwama. So I guess we have to leave that for your next study, but any thoughts that you wanted to add on the India-Pakistan ceasefire agreement?
I will simply refer again to the book that I cited by Foreign Minister Jaishankar. Increased pressure from China requires decreased pressure from Pakistan. It's classic balance of power politics. Similarly, both sides and I agree with what my Pakistani friends have said, Pakistan's economic situation and the political pressure that the government is now under from the combined opposition requires a change of the subject. And what is a better change of the subject than the prospect of peace and increased trade and business opportunities with India? And I would like to thank everybody for participating in this. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you very much for setting it up for us.
Thank you so much, Colonel Smith, and thank you to all of you as well, Brigadier Sadek, Dr. Kazi, Dr. Malhotra, and Ms. Sadia Taslim. I think we had a lot to get through, and so understandably we're over time, but I want to just tell the audience that you can continue this conversation with our panelists and our other contributors on South Asian Voices, where the video of this discussion will be posted, as well as the essays on which this panel is based. And please do take a look at Colonel Smith's book, The Wellington Experience, which is on the Stimson Center website. Thanks again to all the panelists and to all of you for joining us, and goodbye. We'll see you in the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.